They were huddled so close that Margaret could feel 17 heartbeats through the frozen darkness. Bodies pressed against bodies, breath mixing in clouds of vapor that crystallized on their faces. The barn walls groaned under the weight of wind that screamed across the Rhine Valley like something alive and hunting. Margaret's lips were cracked and bleeding. When she tried to speak, her voice came out as barely a whisper. "We'll freeze by morning," answered. There was nothing to say. They all knew it was true. If you want to hear incredible true stories that reveal the humanity hidden inside history's darkest moments, make sure you subscribe to our channel. Because what happened when that barn door opened would change everything these 17 women believed about their enemy, about their country, and about themselves. It was February 1945, and Germany was dying. Not the dramatic death of battlefield defeat, but the slow, agonizing death of a country being crushed from all sides. Soviet forces were hammering from the east. British and American armies were grinding through the west. And caught between these colliding forces were millions of people who had been told for 12 years that they were the master race, destined to rule the world. Now they were running, desperate, broken, terrified. Margaret Schmidt was 19 years old, though she felt ancient. 3 days ago, she had been a Luftwaffenhoferin, a female anti-aircraft auxiliary stationed near Cologne. Her job was to plot aircraft positions, to help German gunners shoot down the American bombers that came every day to turn German cities into rubble and ash at once. Proud of it, even. She had believed she was defending Germany, protecting her people, doing her patriotic duty. Now she knew the truth. Germany wasn't defending anything. Germany was collapsing. The retreat had started without warning. Officers shouting orders, soldiers abandoning positions, trucks roaring west toward the Rhine. The bridges were being blown to slow the American advance. Everyone was fleeing, and in the chaos, Margaret's unit had been separated from the main column. 17 women cut off, alone, with American forces closing in from 3 directions. Their commander was Oberleutnant Heidi Richter. At 32, she was the oldest among them, a career military woman with sharp features and eyes that had seen too much. She still wore her Wehrmacht uniform, still maintained the crisp bearing of an officer, but something in her face had changed in the last 72 hours. The certainty was gone. The faith. Now there was only calculation, cold mathematics of survival. "We can't stay here," someone said. It was Greta, the medic, 24 years old, with hands that never stopped shaking anymore. "If the Americans find us on the road, they'll what?" Heidi cut her off. "Shoot us? Maybe. Take us prisoner? Probably." She looked at the faces surrounding her, these women she was responsible for. "Or we can keep running until we drop dead in a ditch. Those are our options." The landscape around them told the story of Germany's defeat. Burned-out vehicles littered the roadside, some still smoking. Bomb craters filled with frozen water pocked the fields. Trees stood like skeletal fingers clawing at a gray sky. In the distance, they could hear artillery, sometimes German, sometimes American. It was getting harder to tell the difference. They had been walking for 3 days with almost no food. The Wehrmacht supply system had collapsed. What little food remained went to combat troops, not auxiliary women. Margaret's stomach had stopped hurting from hunger. Now it was just a hollow ache, a constant reminder that her body was consuming itself to stay alive. The cold was worse than the hunger. February in the Rhineland was bitter even in good years. But this winter seemed especially cruel, as if nature itself wanted Germany to suffer. The wind cut through Margaret's thin Wehrmacht-issued coat like it wasn't there. Her feet were numb in boots that were falling apart. When she looked down, she could see her toes through the cracked leather. She thought about her father sometimes. He had died at Stalingrad 3 years ago, frozen in a trench outside a city most Germans couldn't even pronounce. Her mother had died in Dresden 6 weeks ago, incinerated when American bombers turned the city into a firestorm. Margaret had received a letter from an aunt who survived. There was nothing left to bury, the aunt had written, not even ashes we could identify. Now Margaret was freezing too, just like her father. The circle was closing. "There," Heidi said suddenly, pointing, "that barn." They had reached the outskirts of a village. The name didn't matter. Half the villages in the Rhineland looked the same now. Abandoned, damaged, dying. This one had a collection of farm buildings scattered across snow-covered fields. Most were burned or collapsed, but one barn still stood, leaning slightly but intact. "We'll freeze in there just as easily as out here," said Katrin, one of the radio operators. She was 28, cynical, with a scar across her left cheek from shrapnel. "Maybe," Heidi acknowledged, "but at least we'll be out of the wind and hidden. We rest for a few hours, then keep moving at dawn." She searched the barn carefully, watching for any sign of occupation. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges. Inside, it smelled of old hay and animal waste. Cows had lived here once, but they were long gone. probably taken by retreating German troops or liberated by advancing Americans. The hay that remained was moldy and frozen, but it was something. Some insulation against the cold. There were 17 of them in total. Martyr Tay knew all their names now. 3 days of shared misery had made them intimate in the way only desperation can. There was Anneliese, just 17, who cried quietly every night for her mother. There was Ilse, the senior radio operator, who still wore her headset around her neck like a talisman, even though the radio was destroyed. There was Frau Weber, a 44-year-old civilian volunteer who had taught English before the war, and now couldn't stop shivering. There was Sophia, an intellectual who quoted Goethe and wondered aloud how Germany had fallen so far. There were a dozen others, each with their own stories, their own losses, their own private terrors. They piled the hay in the center of the barn and huddled together for warmth. Body heat was all they had. They pressed close, trying to share what little warmth their starving bodies could generate. The youngest women went in the center. The older ones, including Heidi, took positions on the outside, sacrificing themselves to protect the others. Darkness fell fast in February. By 5 in the evening, it was completely black inside the barn. The only light came from the gaps in the walls where wind whistled through. The temperature dropped viciously. Martyr Tay could feel the cold seeping into her bones, spreading from her feet and hands toward her core. This was how freezing to death happened. Slowly. The body giving up from the outside in. "We should talk," Greta said. "Stay awake. If we fall asleep, we might not wake up." So they talked. Quiet voices in the darkness, sharing memories of before. Before the war. Before the bombs. Before the running and the fear and the cold. Anneliese talked about her village in Bavaria, about festivals with music and dancing, about a boy she had liked who was now dead on the Eastern Front. Frau Weber talked about teaching children, about the bright faces of students learning English verbs, about a world where Germany and England weren't enemies but just countries with different languages. Sophia recited poetry, Hölderlin and Rilke, words about beauty and transcendence that felt impossibly distant in this frozen barn. Margarete talked about her mother, not about her death, that was too raw, too close, but about before, about baking bread together, about her mother's hands, always busy, always creating something, about the way she sang while she worked, old folk songs that Margaret could still hear if she closed her eyes. "My mother told me once," Margaret said, her voice barely audible over the wind, "that the Americans were mongrels, race mixers, that they would defile German women if they caught us." She paused. She believed that. We all believed that. Silence. Then Heidi spoke from the outer ring of bodies. "We believed a lot of things." More silence. Because what could they say? They had believed in the Fuhrer. They had believed in the 1,000-year Reich. They had believed Germany was destined for greatness. Now they were freezing in a barn, waiting to be captured or to die, and all those beliefs seemed like fever dreams, lies, told to children. Katrin spoke up, her voice hard. "You know what I think? I think we were fools. All of us. We believed because it was easier than questioning. Because it felt good to think we were special." "Treason," someone said weakly. "Treason?" Katrin laughed, a bitter sound. "Against what? The Reich is dead. Hitler is probably dead too, cowering in some bunker while we freeze. What are we being loyal to?" Heidi should have reprimanded her, should have maintained discipline. But she didn't. Instead, she said quietly, "Save your strength. We'll need it if we survive the night." If. Not when. If. The hours crawled by. They tried to stay awake, but exhaustion was a physical weight. Some of the women drifted off despite the cold. Others stayed awake, listening to the wind, to the distant sounds of artillery, to the occasional vehicle passing on distant roads. Friend or enemy? They didn't know. They didn't dare look. Around midnight, Frau Hoffmann, one of the oldest women at 51, began breathing strangely. Rapid, shallow breaths that wheezed in her chest. Greta crawled to her, felt her pulse. "Her heart," Greta whispered to Heidi. "It's struggling. The cold, the stress. If we don't get her warm soon." But there was no warmth to give. They pulled her tighter into the center, surrounded her with bodies. But it wasn't enough. Margaret could hear Frau Hoffmann's breathing growing more labored. This was how it would happen. One by one, they would weaken and die. By morning, some of them wouldn't wake up. At 2 in the morning, Margaret whispered the words that had been echoing in her mind since sunset. "We'll freeze by morning." This time, several voices answered. Yes, they had accepted it. Death was coming. Slow and cold and certain. Margaret thought about the propaganda they'd been fed for years. The Americans were savages, monsters. If they caught you, they would torture you, humiliate you, kill you. Better to die fighting than surrender. Death before dishonor. Facing actual death, Margaret wondered, was it true? Or was that another lie, like all the other lies? She would probably never know. She closed her eyes and tried to remember warmth, her mother's kitchen, sunlight through windows, the feel of hot bread fresh from the oven. She held on to those memories like they were the last precious things in the world. The darkness was absolute. The cold was absolute. Death felt very close. And then the world ended. The sound came first, a scraping noise, metal on wood. Someone was moving the barn door. Margaret's eyes snapped open. Around her, other women stirred, confused and terrified. After hours of silence, any sound was shocking. But this sound meant discovery. Someone had found them. The door groaned as it was pulled open. Light flooded in, blinding after hours of darkness. Margaret threw her arm across her face, squinting against the sudden brightness. Behind the light were silhouettes, multiple figures, men, soldiers. For a moment, nobody moved. The women were frozen, not from cold now, but from fear. This was it. Whatever was going to happen would happen now. Then one of the silhouettes spoke. The language was English. American English. Jesus Christ, there's women in here. The voice was young, shocked, and distinctly non-threatening. Margaret's mind struggled to process this. Where was the aggression? The cruelty? Where was the monster from the propaganda? Another voice, also American, also young. Are they alive? Check for. A third voice, urgent. Get the medic, now. They're freezing. The figures moved into the barn, and as Margaret's eyes adjusted, she could see them clearly. 3 American soldiers in winter gear, their breath making clouds in the frozen air. They carried rifles, but the weapons were slung across their backs, not pointed at anyone. One soldier, tall with red hair visible under his helmet, stopped a few feet from the huddled women. His face registered pure shock. He called back over his shoulder in English, then tried German. His pronunciation was terrible, but the meaning was clear. Hilfe? You need Hilfe? Help? Heidi struggled to sit up. As the ranking officer, she should surrender formally, maintain dignity, maintain dignity, maintain discipline. But her body wouldn't cooperate. Her legs were stiff from cold. Her voice was barely a whisper. We. She switched to broken English, words from before the war. Please, help us. The red-haired soldier, the name tape on his uniform read. McKenna pulled off his heavy coat without hesitation. He moved toward Margaret and draped it over her shoulders. The coat was still warm from his body heat. The warmth was shocking, almost painful against her frozen skin. It smelled like cigarettes and coffee and American soap. You're gonna be okay, McKenna said, speaking slowly like she might not understand. You're safe now. Safe. The word seemed impossible. They were German. He was American. They were enemies. How could she be safe? But he was kneeling beside her, not threatening, not cruel, just concerned. His eyes were blue. He looked young. Maybe 22. Around her age. Another soldier was speaking rapidly into a radio handset. This is Sergeant Harrison. We've got civilians in the barn at coordinates. Yes, women. German women. Maybe 17 of them. They're in bad shape. We need medics, blankets, transport. Yes, sir. Copy that. He turned to McKenna and the third soldier, a shorter man with dark skin and kind eyes. Medics are coming. Santos, watch the perimeter. McKenna, stay with them. I'm getting more help. The soldier named Santos nodded and took position near the door, rifle ready, but pointed at the ground. He kept glancing back at the women, his expression troubled. The red-haired McKenna stayed close to Margaret. Cold? He asked, making an exaggerated shivering motion. Margaret nodded. Then finding her voice, she managed in careful English. Very cold. All night. McKenna's expression darkened. All night? Jesus. He looked around at the other women, taking in their condition. Frozen clothes, blue lips, shivering bodies. One woman, Frau Hoffman, who wasn't moving much at all. He called to Harrison. Sergeant, this one's in bad shape. Real bad. Harrison returned, took one look at Frau Hoffman, and spoke urgently into his radio again. Make that critical. We need immediate medical evacuation for at least one, maybe more. Yes, I'll hold. Martyr watched this unfold with something like disbelief. These were American soldiers, the enemy, the monsters from the propaganda films, but they were calling for help, using their resources. Treating German women like people who mattered. More sounds outside. Vehicle engines. American voices shouting coordinates and orders. Within minutes, 2 more soldiers arrived, but these wore different uniforms, red crosses on white armbands. Medics. The first medic through the door was a black man, around 30, with intelligent eyes and calm, efficient movements. His name tape read WEBBB. He carried a medical bag and moved with practiced authority. "Okay, let's assess," he said to his companion, a younger white medic. "Hypothermia, likely multiple cases. Check core temperatures, look for frostbite, watch for cardiac issues in the older patients." He knelt beside Frau Hoffmann and began working immediately, checking pulse, listening to her heart, opening his bag to pull out equipment that looked incredibly sophisticated compared to anything Margaret had seen in the Wehrmacht. "This woman needs emergency warming," Webb announced. "But careful. Too fast, and will shock her system. We need heated blankets, warm fluids, IV access." Greta, the German medic, found her voice. I am medic. I can help." Webb looked up, surprised, then nodded. "Good. What's her name?" "Frau Hoffmann. She is 51. Heart is weak. All night and cold." Webb's face showed respect. "You kept her alive this long. You did good. Now let's finish the job." He handed Greta supplies. "Help me get these blankets on her. We're going to warm her up, slow and steady." Margaret watched a German medic and an American medic working together to save a German woman's life. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Nothing about this matched what she'd been taught. Nothing. More vehicles arrived. The barn that had been their tomb was suddenly filled with activity. More medics. More blankets, actual warm blankets. Military issue. Field stoves being set up. Americans running in and out with supplies and equipment. A female American soldier appeared. A nurse in clean uniform despite the war conditions. She was maybe 30, with brown hair pulled back and a kind, professional face. She moved among the German women, checking them one by one, speaking in a calm voice even though most couldn't understand the words. When she reached Anneliese, the youngest girl who had cried all night, the nurse's expression softened. She pulled a chocolate bar from her pocket, real chocolate, and offered it with a gentle smile. Anneliese stared at the chocolate like it was a hallucination. She hadn't seen real chocolate in 3 years. She looked at Margaret, asking silently if this was allowed, if it was safe. Margaret nodded. Anneliese took the chocolate with trembling hands and bit into it, her eyes filled with tears. The taste of sweetness after years of bitter deprivation was too much. The American nurse patted her shoulder. "It's okay, honey. You're okay now." Corporal Santos, the soldier guarding the door, watched this exchange. Then he reached into his own pocket and pulled out more rations. Crackers, canned meat, a small can of fruit. He distributed them to the nearest women, speaking in English they couldn't understand, but in a tone that needed no translation. Kindness. Simple human kindness. Margaret accepted a cracker from him. She bit into it carefully. It was bland, but it was food. Real food. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the taste hit her tongue. Her stomach cramped immediately, protesting after days of near starvation, but she forced herself to eat slowly. Around her, the other women were doing the same. Eating, drinking water from American canteens, being wrapped in warm blankets, being treated like human beings instead of enemies. Heidi sat apart slightly, still trying to maintain some military bearing even as American soldiers worked around her. McKenna approached her with a blanket. "Ma'am, you're an officer?" Heidi nodded stiffly. "Oberleutnant. Lieutenant." She struggled with English. "I surrender, formally. My women are prisoners." "Ma'am, with respect, I think you're patients right now more than prisoners. Let's get you warm first. Deal with the paperwork later." He draped the blanket over her shoulders anyway. Heidi accepted it, her facade cracking slightly. "You are kind. I did not expect kindness." McKenna's expression was complicated. "War's almost over anyway, ma'am. No point being cruel now." He paused. Maybe no point ever. Field stoves were lit, filling the barn with precious warmth. Coffee was brewed real coffee and distributed in tin cups. Margaret wrapped her frozen fingers around a cup and felt the heat seeping into her palms. She raised it to her lips and sipped. The coffee was bitter and strong and absolutely delicious. Across from her, Katrin was crying as she drank hers. "How do they have so much?" she whispered in German. "We were told they were starving, that the war was bleeding them dry." Sophia, the intellectual, answered quietly. "We were lied to about that too. About everything." Medic Webb was still working on Frau Hoffmann, but her breathing had stabilized. The emergency warming was working. Greta stayed beside him, following his instructions, professional respect flowing between them despite the language barrier in the uniforms. "She's gonna make it," Webb finally announced. He looked at Greta. "You did good work keeping her alive. Real good work." Greta's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you for helping." Webb nodded. "That's what medics do. We help. It doesn't matter which side." More American personnel arrived. An officer, a captain, who spoke fluent German. He introduced himself politely, took down their names, explained that they would be transported to a POW facility where they would receive medical care and proper food and shelter. His tone was professional but not unkind. He treated them with more respect than German officers had shown in recent weeks. Trucks arrived to transport them. Not cattle cars, not cages. Just regular military trucks with canvas covers and benches. The medics carefully moved Frau Hoffmann onto a stretcher and loaded her into an ambulance. Webb climbed in beside her, still monitoring her condition. As the women were helped into the trucks not forced, Margaret found herself next to McKenna again. "Thank you," she said in English. "You saved us." McKenna looked embarrassed. "Just doing my job." "No." Margaret shook her head. "You were kind. You did not have to be kind." He met her eyes. For a moment, the war fell away. Just two young people who had survived the night. "Take care of yourself, Margaret," he said. She realized she had told him her name at some point. She realized he had remembered it. As the trucks pulled away from the barn, Margaret looked back. The place where she thought she would die was shrinking in the distance. The place where Americans, the enemy, had saved her life. She looked at the other women in the truck. All of them wrapped in American blankets. All of them drinking American coffee. All of them alive because Americans had chosen mercy over cruelty. Ilse spoke what they were all thinking. "We were told they were monsters." Heidi responded, her voice hollow with realization. "We were told a lot of things." The trucks drove through the devastated German countryside toward an uncertain future, but for the first time in days, that future included the possibility of survival. And something else, something more dangerous than death, doubt, about everything they had believed, about their country, about their enemies, about themselves. The barn had saved them from freezing, but what they had witnessed there, the kindness, the humanity, the mercy threatened to shatter every lie they had been taught. And that shattering, Margaret realized as the truck bounced along the rutted road, was only beginning. The POW camp near Aachen looked nothing like what Margaret had expected. She had imagined barbed wire and guard towers with machine guns and starving prisoners begging for scraps. She had seen photographs in German newspapers of Allied POW camps, grim places where men stood hollow-eyed behind fences. But those photographs, she was beginning to understand, had been propaganda, just like everything else. The camp was a former German military barracks that the Americans had repurposed. Yes, there was a fence. Yes, there were guard towers, but the guards looked bored more than menacing. They smoked cigarettes and read magazines and waved at passing trucks. Inside, rows of wooden barracks stood in neat lines. Smoke rose from chimneys. Women walked between buildings without guards hovering over them. It looked almost normal. The 17 women were processed through intake. American clerks, some of them women, took down their names and information with efficient politeness. A female doctor examined each of them, checking for frostbite, malnutrition, and disease. The doctor was thorough but gentle. When she examined Margaret's feet, she winced at the damage. "Second-degree frostbite on 3 toes," she said to a nurse in English, then tried German. "You will heal, but must be careful. Keep warm, keep clean." Margaret nodded. The doctor gave her ointment and clean bandages. Real medical supplies, not the ersatz materials Germany had been using for the last 2 years. They were assigned to Barrack 7, a long wooden building with a coal stove at each end and rows of bunk beds down the middle. The bunks had mattresses, actual mattresses with sheets and blankets. Margaret climbed onto a lower bunk and pressed her hand against the mattress, testing if it was real. It gave under her touch. Soft. Clean. Real. "This is better than Wehrmacht barracks," Greta said quietly, claiming the bunk above Margaret. "This is better than where we slept, when we were the ones in charge." Other women were moving into the barracks. German women from other units, other places. Some had been here for weeks. They looked healthy, well-fed. Their faces had color. One woman, maybe 25 with short blonde hair, approached them. "You're new? From where?" "Rhineland," Heidi answered. "Captured 3 days ago." "You?" "Captured in December, near Bastogne." The woman sat on a nearby bunk. "I'm Brigida. I was with a signal unit. They got us during the Ardennes offensive." She looked them over. "You look rough, but you'll recover. The Americans feed us well. 3 meals a day. Real food." Katrin laughed bitterly. "Why? We're the enemy. Why waste fruit on us?" Brigida shrugged. "Geneva Convention, they say. Plus they have so much. You'll see. They have everything. It's obscene how much they have." That evening, Margaret understood what Brigida meant. The mess hall was a large building filled with long tables and benches. The 17 women lined up with metal trays, following other prisoners through a serving line. American soldiers stood behind the counter, spooning food onto plates. Margaret stared at what was being served. Mashed potatoes, real meat and gravy. canned vegetables, fresh bread with butter, canned peaches for dessert. Her tray was piled high, more food than she had seen in months, maybe years. She sat at a table with her group. For a long moment nobody ate. They just stared at the food, unable to reconcile this abundance with everything they knew about the war. Anneliese started crying. My mother is starving in Bavaria. We're eating like this, and she's starving. Frau Weber, who had recovered enough to join them, put her arm around the girl. Eat, child. You being hungry won't make your mother less hungry. Eat. So they ate. Margaret forced herself to go slowly, but her body wanted to devour everything immediately. The potatoes were creamy. The meat was tender. The bread was soft and white, nothing like the sawdust-filled ersatz bread Germany had been producing. When she bit into the canned peaches, the sweetness was almost painful. Around them, other German women were eating with the same desperate intensity. The mess hall was mostly silent except for the sounds of forks on metal trays. Women who had been starving were being fed by the enemy. The contradiction was staggering. After dinner, they returned to their barracks. The coal stoves were lit, filling the space with warmth. Margaret lay on her bunk, staring at the wooden ceiling. Some ma. Her stomach was full for the first time in weeks. Her body was warm. She was clean from the shower they'd been allowed. She should feel grateful. She should feel relief. Instead, she felt confused, angry, lost. It doesn't make sense, she said aloud. From the bunk above, Greta responded. What doesn't? Any of it. We were told they were savages, that they would torture us, humiliate us, but they saved us. They're feeding us, treating us better than our own military did. Margaret's voice broke. Why? Why are they kind when they have every reason to hate us? Silence filled the barracks. Other women were listening now. Finally, Heidi spoke from across the room. Because we were lied to, about everything. The Americans, the war, all of it. Sophia, the intellectual, sat up on her bunk. I think it's more than lies. I think we wanted to believe. It felt good to think we were special, superior, destined for greatness. The alternative was to question everything, and that was too frightening. So we're cowards, Katrin said flatly. We believed because we were too cowardly to doubt. Maybe, Sophia acknowledged. Or maybe we're human. Humans want to belong, want to believe their suffering has meaning, want to think their side is righteous. She paused. The Americans probably tell themselves stories too, that they're heroes, liberators, the good guys. But they are the good guys, Anneliese said quietly. They saved us. Really, they saved us. This time, Sophia said. But I've heard rumors, things they've done in other places. Bombing civilians. The Americans aren't perfect either. Nobody is. That's the point. We were taught to see in absolutes, pure good, pure evil. But maybe everything is more complicated. The conversation continued into the night. Women who had never questioned authority were suddenly questioning everything. The barn had cracked something open. Now the POW camp was widening that crack into a chasm. Days turned into weeks. A routine established itself. Wake at 6:30. Breakfast at 6:30. Work details in the morning kitchen duty. Laundry. Light maintenance. All voluntary, though most women participated. It gave them something to do, and they were paid in cigarettes and chocolate that could be traded. Lunch at noon. Then afternoons of free time. Some women wrote letters home, though mail service was sporadic. Others read books from the camp library. American books, German books, even some English-language newspapers. In the evenings, there were recreation activities, cards, music, conversation. Margaret volunteered for English classes. An American sergeant named Ruth Cohen taught them basic phrases and grammar. Cohen was 26, from New York, with dark hair and intelligent eyes. She was patient with her students, correcting pronunciation gently, encouraging them to practice. During the third class, Margaret noticed Cohen's necklace, a small Star of David on a thin chain. After class, Margaret approached her. Sergeant Cohen, you are Jewish? Cohen's expression became guarded. Yes. Is that a problem? No. Margaret struggled with English and emotion. I want to say, I am sorry for what Germany did to your people. Cohen studied her for a long moment. Did you personally do anything to Jewish people? No. But I served the system. I believed the lies. I looked away when neighbors disappeared. Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. I am complicit. Cohen sighed. Yeah, you are. But you're also 19 years old, and you were lied to your entire life. So what are you going to do now? That's the question. Are you going to learn? Change? Be better? Or are you going to stay comfortable in the lies? I want to learn, Margaret said. I want to understand. How do I live with what my country did? Cohen's expression softened slightly. You live with it by acknowledging it, by never forgetting, by making sure it never happens again. That's all any of us can do. In April, newspapers arrived with photographs from liberated concentration camps. Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, images of emaciated prisoners, mountains of corpses, gas chambers, systematic extermination facilities. The photographs were posted on bulletin boards throughout the camp. American guards made sure every prisoner saw them. This wasn't optional. This was confrontation. Margaret stood in front of the images, forcing herself to look. Her stomach turned. Her hands shook. Other women around her were crying, denying, arguing that the photos were fake. But Margaret knew they weren't fake. Deep down, she had always known. There had been rumors for years, whispers about what happened to the Jews, to the Roma, to political prisoners. She had chosen not to believe. It was easier that way. Now, she couldn't look away. Greta stood beside her, also staring at the photographs. I was a medic. I took an oath to heal people, and I served this. Her voice was hollow. I served a system that did this. They stood there for a long time, bearing witness. It felt like the least they could do. Look, acknowledge, remember. Well, maters, remember. Well, that night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in her bunk, staring at darkness, thinking about the barn, about McKenna's kindness, about the coffee and blankets and medical care, about how the Americans could have been cruel but chose mercy instead. And she thought about the photographs, about how Germany could have been merciful but chose cruelty instead. The contrast was unbearable and necessary. Around her, she could hear other women crying quietly in the dark. They were all processing the same realization. They had believed in something monstrous. They had served something evil. And now they had to live with that knowledge. But they also had to live. Somehow. They had survived the barn. They had survived the collapse of everything they believed. Now they had to figure out what came next. Margaret pulled out the small notebook she'd been given by the camp supply officer. She began to write by moonlight coming through the window. We were told the Americans would torture us. Instead, they saved us. We were told we were superior. Instead, we were complicit in horror. Everything I believed was a lie. So now what? How do I build a self from the ruins of lies? How do I become someone worth the mercy I was shown? She didn't have answers, but she was asking the questions. And maybe, she thought, that was the beginning. May 8, 1945. The war in Europe ended. In the POW camp, American soldiers celebrated with fireworks and music and shouting. German prisoners stood silent, watching their captors rejoice in a victory that meant German defeat. The emotional landscape was complicated. Relief that the killing was over. Shame at the loss. Uncertainty about what came next. Margaret stood at the fence, watching the celebration. A jeep drove past with soldiers cheering and waving American flags. One of them was McKenna. She recognized his red hair. He saw her and waved, not mocking, just acknowledgement. They had both survived. She waved back. The months that followed were strange. The camp remained operational, but its purpose shifted. Germany was occupied now, divided into zones controlled by different Allied powers. The infrastructure was destroyed. Cities were rubble. Millions of displaced people wandered, looking for home, looking for family, looking for some way to rebuild. Where would the prisoners go? What was left to return to? In September, repatriation began. Prisoners were processed, interviewed, classified according to their level of involvement with the Nazi regime. The interviews were called denazification. Americans asking questions, deciding who was guilty, who was complicit, who was merely caught in circumstances beyond their control. The interview was conducted by an American captain who spoke perfect German. He reviewed her file, asked about her service, her beliefs, her actions. Did you join the Nazi Party? No, I was too young for formal membership. Did you believe in Nazi ideology? Margaret hesitated. Lying would be easy. But after everything, lying felt impossible. Yes, I believed. I was taught to believe, and I didn't question. I was wrong. The captain made notes. Did you participate in any atrocities? War crimes? Violence against civilians or prisoners? No. I plotted aircraft positions. I never hurt anyone directly. Right. But you supported the system. Yes. Margaret met his eyes. I supported it. I served it. I am complicit in what it did. The captain studied her. You're 19 years old. You were 15 when the war started. You were a child. I stopped being a child the moment I put on a uniform, Margaret said quietly. More notes. Then the captain looked up. You're classified as Mitlaufer, a follower. Lowest threat category. You're cleared for release. He paused. What will you do? Where will you go? Cologne. If there's anything left of it. There isn't much, the captain said gently. But there are people. Survivors. They're rebuilding. You'll rebuild too. In October, Margaret stood at the camp gate with a small bag containing everything she owned. Clean clothes, a few ration bars, the notebook she'd been writing in, and a photograph that Corporal Santos had taken months ago. Margaret wrapped in an American blanket, drinking coffee, alive. Heidi stood beside her, also being released. They had decided to travel together. Safety in numbers. Other women from the barn were leaving too, heading in different directions, carrying their own bags and their own burdens. Before leaving, Margaret walked to the administrative building. She had written a letter weeks ago. Now she handed it to Sergeant Cohen, who worked in the mailroom. Can you make sure this reaches him? Margaret asked. The envelope was addressed to Private James McKenna, Boston, Massachusetts, USA. Cohen took the letter. I'll do my best. She looked at Margaret. You're going to be okay, you know. It'll be hard, but you'll make it. How do you know? Because you're asking the right questions, because you're taking responsibility, because you're trying to be better. Cohen smiled slightly. That's more than a lot of people do. The train journey to Cologne took 2 days. The trains were crowded with refugees, former prisoners, displaced persons, all flowing through a broken Germany trying to find their way. Margaret and Heidi sat by a window, watching the devastated landscape scroll past. Every city they passed was damaged. Some were completely destroyed. When they reached Cologne, Margaret barely recognized it. The cathedral still stood, miraculously intact among the ruins, but the rest of the city was gone, block after block of rubble. Walls standing alone with no buildings attached. Streets cleared through the debris, but lined with destruction. Her neighborhood didn't exist anymore, just empty lots with weeds growing through broken bricks. Her family home was a crater. She found her aunt living in the cellar of a destroyed apartment building, sharing the space with 3 other families. When her aunt saw her, she cried and embraced her. You're alive! You're alive! I thought. I'm alive, Margaret confirmed. I survived. The months that followed were brutal. Winter 1945-46 was called the Hunger Winter. Food was scarce. Fuel was scarcer. People burned furniture to stay warm. They ate whatever they could find. Margaret joined the Trümmerfrauen, the rebel women, hauling bricks and clearing debris by hand, rebuilding, one broken brick at a time. It was hard, physical labor. Her back ached. Her hands bled. But it felt right. Penance through effort. Rebuilding what had been destroyed. In March 1946, a letter arrived. American postmark, Boston. Margaret's hand shook as she opened it. McKenna had written back. His handwriting was messy, but readable. He was home, enrolled in college on the GI Bill, studying to become a doctor. He thought about the barn sometimes, about the war, about the strange way lives intersected. I'm glad you made it, he wrote. I'm glad you're rebuilding. That's what matters now. Not what we were, but what we become. Margaret wrote back. Thus began a correspondence that would last decades. Not romantic, something else, something harder to define. 2 people who had met in the worst circumstances, who had seen each other at their most vulnerable, who had witnessed each other's humanity when everything said they should be enemies. And they wrote about their lives, about recovery, about trying to make sense of what they had experienced. McKenna wrote about nightmares, about struggling to readjust to civilian life, about becoming a doctor because he wanted to heal instead of harm. Margaret wrote about guilt, about rebuilding, about trying to create something good from the ruins of something terrible. Years passed. Germany recovered with shocking speed. The Marshall Plan poured American money into reconstruction. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, transformed the country. Democracy took root. The Federal Republic was born. Margaret became a nurse. She worked in public hospitals, caring for the sick and injured. It felt like the right path. Greta had inspired her during those months in the camp. Healing felt like the opposite of what Germany had done. Small acts of care in response to systematic cruelty. In 1965, 20 years after the barn, Margaret visited the site. The village had been rebuilt. The barn was gone, replaced by a modern storage building. A young farmer worked the land, unaware of the history beneath his feet. Margaret stood where the barn had been, remembering the cold, the fear, the certainty of death. And then the door opening, light and voices and unexpected mercy. She was 40 now. Her aunt had died 3 years earlier. She had never married, dedicating herself to her work instead. Germany was prosperous, democratic, allied with America. The world had changed completely, but the memory remained sharp. That night. That moment when everything she believed shattered and something new, something true, began to emerge. In 1985, 40 years later, a young documentary filmmaker named Klaus found her. He was making a film about women's experiences in the war. He had found her name in American archives, in records of POW camps. "Will you tell your story?" he asked. Margaret was 60 now, retired, living alone. She had told pieces of the story to friends over the years, but never the whole thing. Never formally. She agreed. The interview was filmed in her small apartment in Cologne. Klaus set up lights and cameras. He asked her to start at the beginning, so Margaret told it. The retreat, the barn, the cold, the certainty of death, and then the Americans, the kindness, the food, the medical care, the mercy when vengeance would have been justified. "Why do you think they were kind?" Klaus asked. Margaret thought for a long moment. "Because they chose to be. That's the lesson, I think. Everything is a choice. We chose to believe lies because it was easier. They chose to be merciful even though cruelty was easier. Every moment, we're choosing who we are." "Do you think you deserve their mercy?" "No," Margaret said immediately. "We didn't deserve it. Germany had done terrible things. We had supported those things. But they gave us mercy anyway. Not because we deserved it, but because that's what humans should do for each other. That's what I learned in that barn. That humanity transcends nationality. That compassion is always a choice, and that we're responsible for the choices we make." Klaus asked his final question. "What do you want people to learn from your story?" Margaret looked directly at the camera. "Question what you're told, especially when it makes you feel superior, especially when it gives you an enemy to hate, because hatred is taught, but compassion is chosen. Those American soldiers chose compassion when they had every reason to choose hatred, and that choice saved my life. Not just physically. It saved my soul. It broke the lies I believed and forced me to see the truth. That's the door I want opened for everyone. The door to truth, to seeing your enemy as human, to choosing mercy over cruelty. Because the alternative is what Germany became, and millions died because we forgot how to see each other as human." In 1986, Margaret received letters from young Germans thanking her for her honesty, for not hiding, for not making excuses, for telling the truth about complicity and choice and the long, hard work of becoming better. McKenna sent her a letter too. He was in his 60s now, still practicing medicine in Boston. "I saw your film," he wrote. "You were brave to tell the truth. That barn changed both of us, I think. Made us think about what humans owe each other. Thank you for sharing our story." Margaret Schmidt lived to age 82. She died in 2007, peacefully, in the same Cologne apartment where she had told her story to Klaus 22 years earlier. In her will, she left her notebooks to the German Historical Museum. 40 years of diary entries, letters, reflections on survival and guilt and redemption. The last entry in her final notebook, written weeks before her death, read, "I was 19 when I learned that the enemy could be kind. I spent the next 63 years trying to deserve that kindness. I don't know if I succeeded, but I tried. I questioned. I changed. I chose compassion when I could. That's all any of us can do. Choose. Every day. Every moment. Choose to see humans instead of enemies. Choose mercy instead of cruelty. Choose truth instead of comfortable lies. That barn taught me. That door opened for me. I hope it opens for everyone. The barn is long gone. The war is history. But the lesson remains. In our darkest moments, we reveal who we are by the choices we make. 17 women learned that the enemy could be merciful. The world still needs people willing to open that door. If this story moved you, if you believe in the power of choosing compassion over cruelty, subscribe to our channel. These stories matter. They remind us that even in hell, humans can choose heaven. Thank you for listening.